Hello and welcome to Dateline New Haven on WNHH-FM, New Haven's home for community radio. I'm Paul Bass, inviting you to look behind the headlines on the stories that make our community tick. We have two New Haveners in the studio today trying to help us figure out what's making our country tick and not. Jacob Hacker and Jonathan Cohen are embarked on a national effort to reimagine our economy. We're told our economy is doing great, according to the gross domestic product, GDP, and we're told that the country thinks the economy's doing badly. So these two gentlemen are here to embark in a project to let us know how it's really doing. So you ready to spill the secrets?
Once and for all.
Yeah. So you're gonna so basically we're gonna really find out the truth, or you're kind of in the process of that. Jacob Hacker is a political science professor at Yale and a longtime national expert on healthcare, among other issues and policy. And Jonathan Cohen is a senior program officer at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So together you're doing a project called the Commission on Reimagining Our Economy. And as I understand your task, based on the article you just had in the Wall Street Journal, is you're arguing, if I have it right, that we have an outdated way of measuring our economy. We look at this number, the GDP, the gross domestic product, and we're saying that tells us if we're doing well or not. And we have this moment now in America where the GDP says we're doing great and inflation is coming down, unemployment is low, profits are up, but the country's telling us we're doing badly. Is that an accurate way to put it, Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say by way of background, the commission, the project, is a cross-partisan, multidisciplinary group of experts, including Jacob, that was convened to, in our sort of parlance, refocus national attention from how the economy is doing in the abstract onto how Americans are doing in particular. And I think there is sort of no better encapsulation of the disconnect between how the economy as an abstract idea is doing and is doing well, as reflected in GDP, versus how Americans themselves are doing as reflected in polling among actual people as to how they feel about the economy, which is that, well, if the GDP looks good, that polling is basically.
But man, milk costs a lot, and the eggs. And that's
Right. So the project as a whole has sort of all these other little tentacles, and is sort of thinking about this sort of human-centric, what we call people-first focus on the economy. And I think our project that we're here to discuss today, the data project, is a really clear encapsulation of that disconnect that we are trying in some ways to help answer.
And over the years, I've read other efforts like this to talk about the happiness index, and it's part of the critique that we always have sort of what's a good for General Motors is good for America approach to defining success. The stock market's up, so therefore everyone's doing well. And, in later years, 50% or more of the country does have money in the stock market, right? Or is that sort of what the issue is, that we have this sort of outdated, inaccurate way of measuring the economy? Or is it just perceptions? A lot of people we would end up in a coffee shop with have this kind of looking from above that says, well, people just don't realize they're doing well. What's wrong with them? Like their unemployment's down. Yeah, prices are up, but their pay's up even more. So there's this sort of kind of killing the Democratic campaigns, right? This sort of attitude that says, well, they're wrong. They don't know how they're doing. But then there's other people say that how perception is formed might not always correlate to the facts. So where does data come into that?
Yeah, so I think, to
and if you wouldn't mind getting real close to the mic, Jacob.
Yeah, sure. No, to step back, I think it's really important to understand that there are sort of two different ways in which you can measure the health of the economy. One would be looking at sort of what we would call objective indicators, GDP being one of them, but a part of the point of the commission's work is that GDP is only a very partial measure. It doesn't take into account inequality. It doesn't take into account people's health or their economic security, or, as you said, sort of how well people feel they can meet the cost of living, or how well they actually can meet the cost of living. And the other side of it would be questions that ask people, how do they perceive the economy? And the happiness questions would be among those, subjective well-being, as the economists term it. And we're really focused on the first set of measures. We're really focused on objective measures, but we think that the failure to adequately measure how people experience the economy, actually experience it in their health and their economic security and their economic opportunity, and even in terms of how they feel about how well democracy is working to help them with their economic troubles, that our failure to adequately explain the objective reality is part of the reason why these subjective measures look so different. Because people, I think it's really a bad idea to start with the idea that people are wrong about how they feel. We know partisanship influences it. We know that people can can get different interpretations from the media. All those things matter. But fundamentally, we have lots of research to suggest this, that, people are pretty good judges of what's their best interest. And more important, that when we think about, is the economy performing well, and do we have the kind of trust in government and each other to get the kind of policies we need, we really have to worry if there are people who feel like persistently the economy is not performing well and democracy is not performing well in making the economy work for everyday Americans.
Interesting, because it's this sort of the roots. This, one might argue, started with Ross Perot and then the Tea Party, where they said that the sucking sound of jobs leaving America, and there were advocates, free trade advocates, who argued, in fact, a lot of those free trade deals helped the people in the states where they're feeling the worst about the economy, because there were sort of supply chains where they were higher up in the business they got, if there's a plant in Mexico, there's parts here, and that it was just perception. But I think you guys are arguing that it's real, that people feel free trade hasn't worked for them, that globalization hasn't worked for them, that there's something real that why they're voting that way and answering that way in the...
Yeah, I'll take it more broadly. Maybe some of them would blame, the China shock or some specific element of globalization. But I think what Jacob was alluding to is people's sense that something is wrong or unfair or not working, even if they don't know whose fault it is or why. And unluckily for Joe Biden, he happens to be in the White House and maybe is sort of bearing the brunt of people's just frustration. But I don't want to sort of assume that they have sort of such a sophisticated analysis that they're willing to go so far as to say, oh, and this is all NAFTA's fault specifically, as much
Right.
as the economy as an idea is set up for people who are not, or is set up for other people. It's something that works for other people, that helps people on Wall Street, and it doesn't help people like me. For people like me, it's a hindrance, or it's a burden. And therefore, if a pollster comes to my house or texts me or calls me and says, "How do you feel about the economy?" I'm going to give it 2 thumbs way down, even if grocery prices
So
are
why
down.
is your work important, which I do think it is, by the way? Why is it important to come up with a better measure than
Well-
GDP to tell us how the economy's doing?
I think most fundamentally that we now have decades of work going back, to the original design of GDP. I love this quote that we have in the Wall Street Journal piece from Simon Kuznets, who designed GDP, where he says, "The welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income." So it's really important that we get the measurement right. And if we have to have one measure to rule them all, maybe it's GDP, though I would probably argue that it would be something closer to that would really get at the distribution of income too, shared prosperity, if you will. But we don't have to have one measure. And the best practices that have been encouraged by scholars and policymakers for years is to have a dashboard, if you will, of indicators. And so we have a pretty simple dashboard. It consists basically of 4 categories: economic security, economic opportunity, health, and political voice. And in each of those, then we have the best available indicators, and we can do this across the entire country. We can look at counties, but we can also look across groups. But it's important that we have this, I think, for 2 reasons. One is just from a simple standpoint of understanding where people are coming from, right? I think it drives so much else if people see that the press and that policymakers are responding to a different reality than they're experiencing. And we have some hypotheses about why that is. There's lots of research that suggests the media, for example, fixates too much on the Dow Jones Industrial Average and the stock market when, as you said, right, it's half of people have stocks. And in any case, most people don't think of the stock market as the best measure of the health of their economy. And we know that policymakers often fixate on big indicators like that, or live in bubbles like Washington, D.C., where the economy is pretty strong. And it matters second, because how do we improve people's economic lives if we're not measuring the right thing? So there's that old saying that, what gets measured gets managed. So if we're measuring the wrong thing, we're doing the wrong thing to try to make people's lives better.
We're talking to Jacob Hacker and Jonathan Cohen, who are at the forefront of a new effort to reimagine our economy, how we measure whether we're doing well or not. So you talked about 4 areas. You're coming up with a core score. So hopefully when our kids are in our positions, they'll be saying, how's the core score? They'll be looking at the headlines. The core score's up. The score goes down. You talk about 4 areas. It is tricky to come up with new data that you're trying to make objective, because there's always a normative aspect to political science, right? You're always trying to get how people feel and why they do stuff into numbers, which is really tricky. How do you do that in a way that doesn't embody your own biases?
Well, Jacob, I'll pick up on one component of our score that Jacob referred to, which is one of the problems with old measures is the lack of geographic granularity. That we have a one GDP for the entire country or one Dow Jones for the entire country, and that just does not reflect the massive disparities between places, between geographies, between states, between parts of within cities that is sort of come to define the modern American landscape. So all this to say, you need to start, first of all, if you're going to build something, a measure, an index that is at a smaller geographic level, you all of a sudden run into data questions in terms of data that is available at this specific granularity that you think is reflective of these national disparities. So we, after some back and forth, chose counties as our measurement, acknowledging that Los Angeles County is one county and there's, however many million people, more people in Los Angeles County than like all of New England or something like that. But that generally counties sort of work well as a measurement. So just to your question, yes, there are biases, but I guess it makes it a lot easier to sort of focus on what matters when the pool of possible things to use of measurements is sort of narrowed for you.
So one idea is you're looking finer grain, what kind of people we're talking about. Another idea is you are taking more kinds of measures, right? Like in what ways do you measured voter participation? Is that you think that's a way to measure how our economy's doing, how many people show up? What if everyone's like happy with the economy and they're not, and they don't vote for that reason? Is that a factor that tells us the economy's not doing well? Or are you talking about how they're invested in the system?
Well, we know that America's low levels of turnout or the disparities in turnout are not because there's lots of people sitting home super happy with the economy, right? There's the reason. So let me just say that we have this quadrant which is about political voice, or this category that's about political voice, one of the 4 areas, hence the term quadrant. But I'm told that we shouldn't use the term quadrant.
How about 1 out of 4?
It sounds a little bit too wonky, but we have political voice in there because it's so fundamental to people's experience of the economy that they feel their democracy is working or not. And here we're really not looking again at people's perceptions, right? We're looking at do people vote? Are they members of civic groups? And are they getting well represented in Washington? Are the things that they want to happening? And so there's a quote that we have in our Wall Street Journal piece from a survey that was done just recently in 2023 that found that 3/4 of Americans agreed that, quote, economists may say things are getting better, but we're not feeling it where I live. And these same kind of surveys find that over and over, people think that a big part of the problem is that their voice isn't being heard, right? So I think it's very hard to disentangle this sense of that democracy is not working well from the sense that the economy is not working well for most Americans. So to get to your larger question and to sort of build on what John said is there's a normative element in all of social science work. And our normative element here is a belief that, in general, right, the goal of policy should be to improve the well-being of Americans. And the measures themselves are not particularly, some are complex, but they're not controversial. They're things like, are people getting more education? Are wages growing? Are there increases in health coverage? Are people living longer? I feel like that may be the least controversial. I feel like we probably have a bipartisan agreement in this country that it'd be better if people are living longer. And I think some folks don't know that the United States has fallen behind other rich democracies in life expectancy, and that there are just unbelievably stark differences across the country in life expectancy.
So that I got those. So those are objective measures.
Yep.
Let me ask you just to push back devil's advocate. So the measure of whether people do not feel represented is one thing you found. Like my people I vote for, they're not representing me because I like this set of outcomes. I want to pass this law on abortion. I want to pass this law on minimum wage, and they're not passing that. A counter argument that would be is that while everyone says they hate Congress, they reelect their Congress people by overwhelming majorities, partly because of just because they're drawn in a way to gerrymander. But I would argue the Congress people actually do know what their people want, and they actually take the positions based on a fine-grained polling, so that in fact, while they say they're not being represented, maybe they are. And there's also 2 senses of democracy, representative versus pure democracy, right? So Ross Perot, when he ran, he said for president, everyone should from home be able to vote on every bill. that's democracy. And other people countered that's not representative democracy, where you elect someone you trust or don't trust based on their ability to find out the details of bills, to negotiate, compromise, and then every 2 years we look back at how they do and vote on them. So I'm not sure that matching up, I'm not saying it's not true, but matching up what people say they want in polls for issues and then how their people vote is really a measure of whether they're feeling represented, if they therefore then vote 80% for Rosa DeLauro.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's
most
worth
of her
noting
colleagues.
that they would probably I like Rosa a lot,
Yeah, me
but
too.
I think they would probably vote 80% for almost any Democrat, and that kind of gives
And
you.
throughout the country, they vote 80% for the incumbents, right?
Yeah, so I think actually that's the point that I would make is that there are two conceptions of representation. I agree there's a difference between direct democracy and representation. One would be this idea that your representative is like a trustee who's going to look out for your interests over the long term, but might not agree with you on particular issues. And the other is that they're going to like faithfully represent your views. So our measure of representation is more in the delegate model. We actually have questions that asked citizens how they would vote in effect, right? Whether they supported or opposed specific bills.
Mm-hmm.
And based on those questions, we can say what percentage of the items that people said they wanted actually were passed, or not passed, but were approved, voted on by their member of Congress. And just overall, it's like a little less than 50% on average, right? So it's like worse than a coin flip. And I do think if you look, people do feel as if their members, yes, they like their own member more than they like Congress, but there's a widespread sense that their
voice is not heard.
People in Washington are looking out for a lot of powerful interests before they're looking out for their voters. But the other thing I would say is if you think about it as this like a delegate, right, then we can put aside these votes and just ask, like, are people feeling as if government is representing them well overall? And they're not. And I think they're not in part because they feel like there's a fundamental disconnect, right, between what people in Washington think about the economy and what they're experiencing. And by the way, I think that's a bipartisan sense. That poll I showed earlier where they said, economists think one thing and it doesn't reflect in my lives. That majority of Republicans agreed with that too. And when you ask people, do you think special interests dominate Washington? A majority of Republicans agree with that as well. So I appreciate the devil's advocate view, and I wouldn't want to say that that we should see complete congruence between what people want and what happens. After all, right, in a democracy, sometimes you lose, right? But what's really striking is that most of the items that are in these questions that we use are ones where there's pretty strong support overall. They're things like raising the minimum wage. They're things like passing improved health insurance. And a lot of them don't happen, right? So, and a lot of them don't happen because of the
And that's an issue you've studied probably more than any other, which is health insurance.
Yeah.
Why is it that it's popular to have health insurance and basically universal health insurance, and we can never get there? What does that say about our economy or our
I
political
think
system?
it is worth noting that there's a lot of opinion division about healthcare, a lot of it partisan, because any way of getting to universal healthcare involves winners and losers. It over the long term, I think the winners would be a huge group and the losers a small group. But in the short term, people worry about losing their particular coverage. But I think the big issue with healthcare and a lot of these other issues is that our legislators are so polarized about these issues, and so it's so easy to stop things from happening in Washington. And so Congress has ceased to be a really, not to say functioning legislative body.
Is that because
right?
of gerrymandering?
Gerrymandering is a big part of it. It's important to understand, though, that even the Senate, where there isn't gerrymandering, things are problematic. And there, I think it's the skew of the Senate toward less populous states. It's also the case that Republicans have had an edge there, and the Republicans, on average, in the data I've looked at, right, are more likely to be opposed to some of these popular measures. So, I think there's a complex of reasons. But what the effect is as Congress has become more and more incapable of acting on big issues, a lot of policymaking has moved to the Supreme Court. Those decisions, by the way, are not popular. Look at Dobbs. Moved to the states, where, the states are closer to the people, but we've seen a lot of states that have failed to expand Medicaid, even though there's a strong support for that in the state. And so the states are very polarized. So I think it's this mismatch between a hyper-polarized political system and a less polarized, but still quite polarized populace that is at the heart of the problem. And the fact that we're just not governing, right? On a lot of big issues, we're not governing.
and we're talking to Jacob Hacker and Jonathan Cohen, who are leading an effort on reimagining our economy and coming up with a core score, which will give us a better idea of how we're doing than the traditional measures like the GDP. So where are we with the core score? Are you going to start issuing core scores, or what's the plan?
So the data as we released it in November goes back actually all the way through 2005. So we purposely wanted to have this sort of longitudinal view. Spoiler alert on there is we see sort of very little change, actually very little improvement. There's as expected sort of a small dip around the Great Recession, 2007, 2008. Another small dip with COVID, but not as big as we might have expected, mostly because there is no life expectancy data available for COVID yet. So once that comes in, we'll see. But all this to say, yes, we are currently working on the 2022 iteration of the score. Thank your local, I guess, member of the Census Bureau for the 2-year data lag that sort of is always going to persist on this. And then we are hoping that, the score would be sort of or some element of the score will be an annual thing. And again, I don't think we're expecting to see dramatic changes, but with such geographic granularity, it can make a really big difference to see how, one county.
What is the takeaway? How is our economy doing based on the core?
We don't have international comparison, which Jacob already alluded to, right? Which might be, on something like the happiness index or some of these other measures might be the best way to say, oh, we're doing better than Uruguay or worse than Germany or whatever. But what stood out to me is just the lack of improvement in well-being in the United States for now. Almost no improvement in 15 years of data. In that on measures, there are some measures that do go up a lot. Health insurance coverage since roughly 2011, the passage of Obamacare, and then state level adoption, that skyrockets. But there is a basically 1-for-1 decrease in the measure of economic security that totally wipes out measures, the increase in the health measures. So
people do feel like they're one paycheck away from. So Nicholas Kristof this morning in the Times argued that in fact, by any objective measure, our economy is blowing away the entire Western world. That everyone got hit by COVID, everybody had inflation, and that we're doing better. Is he just wrong?
Well, I think the comparison with other countries is different from what we're doing.
Right.
And it could be that we are, that we're treading water better or something like that. In other countries, you see people going under. But I do think it's important to note, that our data ends in 2021. And so that is a particularly poor period. And I think we will see improvement. And so that helps explain the difference. But the other thing to say is I think that Kristof is correct that over the very long term, we've seen a big increase in well-being in rich countries in the U.S. too, but that the U.S. has had
not happiness. We're not happier.
Yeah, so it depends on the country, but I think that actually can be explained by the other point I was going to make, which is that we've seen, a lot of indicators of well-being in the U.S. grow very stubbornly slowly or even decline. We've seen increases in premature mortality, death in the United States, which is really unheard of in rich democracies. And inequalities rising has meant there's been a bigger, we're much more unequal than many countries, so we've seen a bigger wedge between how the overall economy is doing and how middle-class Americans are doing. But I would take one more thing. So I see the slow growth overall is one part of what we show, but the other is this really big, diversity of experience. So where you live really determines the kind of economy you're experiencing. And in particular, right, I was really struck by Washington, D.C. is like the economic growth, I wouldn't say engine of the country, because I don't know how much the engine is driving other places, but it's really a pocket of great affluence and growth, and that can't help but create a bit of a inside the beltway disconnect. The other thing I see in these data is that there are places where income suggests people are doing well, but if you start to look more deeply, right, it's housing costs and insecurity and health are all doing poorly. And I think that's the reality that we've been facing, is that it's, GDP and jobs are really important, but for a lot of people, their finances are precarious. Health is not improving in the area that they're in. Housing has become a huge issue, as you know. And so I think Kristof is totally correct.
But he's not looking at the border
to drive home that, that we've seen a fast recovery. And I think it vindicates some of the policy decisions that were made. But I don't think that undercuts A, the long-term story, or B, the sort of the real problems that are showing up and that are particularly marked in some parts of the country.
So how did you two get together on this project? How did this come about and why?
What I do for a living is I work at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, where I am the lead staffer for the project. That I'll just give credit to our president, David Oxtoby, who, when he assumed the presidency in, I think it was 2019, he basically saw the economy as a major issue that he wanted to work on, and that he felt needed specifically the Academy's sort of special touch of cross-partisan, multidisciplinary work. So our commission is not just, I guess, present company excluded, is not just sort of the usual band of economists and business leaders just talking about tariffs and interest rates.
I am neither economist nor
right,
business
but so he plays one on TV sometimes. But it has political scientists like Jacob, but also novelists, labor leaders, community leaders, religious leaders, sort of different folks than you normally get in a room talking about the economy. And that's sort of the origin of this project. And we were sort of lucky to recruit Jacob as an esteemed member of our esteemed group. And then sort of once this group got going, it sort of became clear that the metrics, the way we used to measure the economy in the first place, was part of the problem. And again, as I said before, sort of part of this mismatch. And that sort of opened up the rabbit hole that we have spent 3 years falling further and further into, and that we've now since emerged with the core score in hand.
And Jacob, you've spent decades doing public policy work as a professor at Yale, especially healthcare. How does this fit into the work you do and your mission as an academic and policy person?
Well, I think it's really important for two reasons. One is it really was an amazingly diverse group, both in terms of people's backgrounds and professions, but also in terms of ideological positions. And we all came to the agreement that it was the right thing to do to focus on the well-being of Americans, as opposed to sort of these top-line indicators about the overall economy. And I think that's a really important step. And I think we shouldn't overstate what that means, but we shouldn't understate it either. And then the second thing I would say about how this fits in is that the Academy is not the only institution, though it is arguably the most esteemed institution, John, that has been weighing in on this. And I really think we're seeing people talk about how, there's the sort of economic consensus, which was sometimes termed, neoliberalism. Sometimes the Washington consensus is broken down and nothing has really taken its place. And I think that is true, and the polarization that I was talking about is a huge problem. But I do think that there is a incipient kind of perspective that is emerging among experts and business leaders and policymakers that, at the very least, that we need to really think seriously about the sort of structure of the economy and not just about, whether we're dialing up or down interest rates, but about whether antitrust policy or the way in labor unions are
right. You see Josh Hawley uniting with Lita Khan now, the sort of trust busters that Biden administration with the MAGA Republicans are one team now.
Yeah, there are some really interesting odd bedfellows alliances that are forming, and they're forming in a lot of ways because I think this view is both true to the lived experience of Americans who really would benefit from a broader perspective on these issues and want that, and two, it's also, I think, it's also a really important breakthrough because the only way we're going to get to bigger policy solutions, and we have a lot of policy ideas in the Commission's report. And I should just say, since we keep saying core, it's Commission on Reimagining Our Economy. We use core short. I love it, by the way, because it kind of sums up everything about what we're doing, right? That we're caring about the core of what matters for people. But also it's not just the policy solution side of it, right? It's that we're going to be much more attentive, I hope, and the journalists in particular, I hope, will become more attentive to what really matters to Americans.
And I know it's interesting to read the Robert Lighthouser interview this morning about how on trade, again, is another one of those issues where this consensus is completely moved and scrambled, who's on what side.
Yeah.
So, John, you've done a lot of research on gambling.
Yeah.
What's your bet? And on Springsteen.
Yeah.
You did a book on Springsteen. So what's your bet on this project? Is the average person glorified in a Springsteen song going to benefit from our getting better data?
Yeah, I think so. I guess if we're going to talk about neoliberalism, I'll warily use the phrase trickle down. But I think the Academy as an organization, our sweet spot is not sort of maybe reaching the man on the street, though maybe some of our outreach and press work has done that. But it is really to target the influencers who, whether they're policy influencers or business leaders or advocates, who can shape the national conversation, if that exists anymore, and through that process, sort of through meetings with lawmakers, through meetings with NGOs, sort of gradually and fundamentally just sort of push things in the right direction, piece by piece, that might reimagine the economy once and for all.
Well, thank you both, Jacob Hacker and Jonathan Cohen, for letting us in on the new effort to rethink our economy, how we even think about our economy in the first place, so that we can come up with better solutions for our democracy and the future of our country.
Thanks so much.
Where do you want people to go to find out more?
It's the core score itself that we've referenced a couple times lives at corescore.us. And then the project as a whole is at amicad.org/economy.
All right. Well, thanks again for joining us. Thanks to Harry Droz behind the controls. We're going to take it out with the Afro-Semitic Experience performing I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free from their album A Plea for Peace. This is Paul Bass inviting you to fly free with us all day, all night, and all week long at WNHH, New Haven's home for community radio.